Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to the Parrish Art Museum. My name is Corinne Erni. I'm the Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs, and it gives me great pleasure to see so many faces here tonight. Welcome. Welcome to Mel Kendrick's exhibition, Seeing Things in Things. This is a wonderful opening night, and thank you for showing your love to us and to Mel. So, the exhibition highlights 4 decades of Mel Kendrick's tireless inquiry into sculpture. The exhibition includes 70 works made in wood, rubber, cast bronze, concrete, and cast paper, as well as photographs, and extends from the entrance, just as you come in, through the lobby and the first 5 galleries. And I'm sure you've already checked out some of it, but you're welcome to see more of it after the talk. So I'm very proud to say that Mel is a Parrish collection artist and a longtime resident of the East End. So Mel, you're one of ours. Yeah. Yes, give him some love. Thank you. So just a little bit about Mel. His work has been included in numerous exhibitions internationally, beginning with his solo debut at Artist Space in New York in 1974. And in 1984, his work was included in the International Survey of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, and the following year in the Whitney Biennial. In 2009, he was commissioned to create 5 monumental cement sculptures for Addison Square Park. His work is included in many collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, National Gallery of Art in Washington, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Whitney Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and also internationally, he is in the Australian National Gallery in Kemmerer, the Centro Cultural Arte Contemporaneo in Mexico City, and Daimler Kunstsammlung in Berlin. And Mel is also a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Francis J. Greenberger Award, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Academy Award. Quite impressive. So actually, Mel Kendrick Seeing Things in Things was organized by the Addison Gallery of American Art, Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and it was curated by Allison Kemmerer, the Mary Strip and R. Crosby Kemper director. And I think Allison is here in the room with us tonight, right? I think so, yes, she's right back there. Hi, Allison. So, yes. And I'd like to thank our team here at the Parrish who made this show happen in a very short time, I have to say. Thank you to our director, Monica Ramirez Montagut, my former colleague, Alicia Longwell. I think you're in the room too. Yes. Melanie Crader, our Deputy Director of Operations and Administrations, as well as our Curatorial Assistant, Caitlin Halloran, and Curatorial Fellow, Brianna Hernandez. I'd also like to thank our former director, Terry Sultan, who initiated the conversation with the Addison and wrote an essay for the catalogue, which is actually available in our store. And then, of course, I would like to thank everyone who made this exhibition possible. Thanks to the generous contributions by Dorothy Lichtenstein, the Imperfect Family Foundation, William R. Peel, Fiona and Eric Rudin, Jack Shear, the Drawing Room in East Hampton, the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation, Agnes Gund, Linda Hackett, Melinda Hackett, Cal Foundation, David Nolan Gallery in New York, Sandy and Stephen Perlbinder, Susan Dunlevy, Hugh Freund and Sandra Winberg, Francis J. Greenberger, Elliot and Mimi Meisel, John L. Thompson, Raymond Learsey, and Carol Lewitt. Thank you, everyone. It really takes a village. And now, I would like to ask the star of the evening, Mel Kendrick, to join me for a brief conversation to introduce his work. Thank you. Difficult choice, 2 chairs. Mel, congratulations. What a show, what an incredible show, and how beautiful in this space, really. Thank you. You started out with sculpture in the 1970s when sculpture was declared dead, when minimalism and abstraction took hold, and you just went your own way with sculpture. Can you talk a little bit about that time, who influenced you, who were your teachers, who were your heroes at the time?
Yes, actually, art was declared dead. Nobody zeroed in on sculpture. In fact, at that time, I think that sculpture was, anything that wasn't painting, and yeah, it was a difficult time to find my way forward because it seemed like everything had been done, or we were at the end of a certain period of modernism, and that's really what minimal art and conceptual art was. Doing away with the object, doing away with any expression. So there had to be a way out of it. And there were a lot of people were doing what became post-minimal work, which was, I felt, just trying to fill in the little spaces between what these, very well-known artists.
You have to hold the microphone.
It's not working? Okay. Usually my voice goes so far, I can try not to. Okay. So I don't know. The sculpture that I was making in the 70s was very basic in one sense because it was a time when I was involved with fixing up numerous lofts, for artists, which and my own loft, and so it was really based on construction, and I used construction techniques, which were all anyway through that, and things had to be planned and built, and as I said in the catalog, and the reason this show starts in the 80s is because there was a major shift in my work at that time where I moved away from these pre-planned installed objects into individual objects. And I was joking with Carol Dunham about it because it was revolutionary, but only to me, because I was making sculpture and I was putting it on a base, which had been around forever. But that was just something that wasn't done. And you mentioned like my teachers, Robert Morris and Tony Smith, and even Dorothea Rockburn, who I worked for briefly. All these installations, nobody was making objects and presenting them that way. But somehow I felt this radicalization of mine was missed by others.
Not anymore. Let's start with Nemo, that big spider-like sculpture in the big gallery, in Gallery 1. That is quite a unique piece, and it's one of the earliest that we have here from 1982, I believe. And how did that happen, and how did you go from there to making the sculptures that you then went on to make?
Well, Nemo was a culmination of work like that. It was more extreme in its, the radical. I don't know what I would call it, but the other pieces leading up to it were much more architectural, and I actually was going to made it for my second show at John Weber Gallery. My first show had been at 420 West Broadway, which was a classic space and a place that I'd always visited through the 70s. Then he moved into a much smaller gallery, so I never showed it. But in the meantime, I literally was working with this more rough-cut wood, and I started sort of doodling on the side, making small pieces, and they were quick, and somehow they were more powerful. I liked them. They were good. They were interesting, and at first I thought maybe too easy, but that's because I had set out this tremendous project for myself. So actually, I cannibalized that piece and other pieces like it to start making these small pieces, and that's when I worked on the presentation and the base and all that. So it was quite a shift.
Right. You have said that sculpture is poetry in space, and I think it really shows. What also strikes me is the way you work. You use usually one block of wood and take it apart, you rip it apart, you chainsaw it apart, you make all kinds of things with it and put it back together and make it into this really incredible sculpture. Can you talk a bit more about that process?
I think that, well, first of all, it's kind of cheap. I'd buy a piece of wood and I'd cut it and I'd have all these pieces left over, and it seemed logical to bring them back into the fold. And So I'm not exactly sure why or how that happened, but it is something that pretty much stayed with my work throughout this whole period, is everything that I cut out, I used again. And so the sculptures are not, about gathering pieces off the floor of the studio and sticking them together. There is this internal logic, as I see it, and I think that it's sometimes perceivable. Sometimes you can see what's going on, what came from what, but mostly I think it's subconscious, and it's you sense through the curves, through the zigzags, whatever it is, that you are seeing another part of the same thing reversed. So it's all about turning things inside out and putting them back into the object.
And you have said that you don't make plans, you don't draw. You said you draw with your chainsaw. You actually draw while making, or that's a complete new definition of drawing or making work.
Yes, I love it. Someone just pointed out that the wall text says I use a chainsaw like a pencil. That's not quite.
It's a big pencil.
I like that. Anyway, yes, I was working in a way of cutting through the wood, and I never, from that point on, I've never drawn or rendered what I think I'm making. It all just happens in making the pieces.
But sure, you have something in your mind when you start, and then how does it go from there? Does it just evolve as you take the wood apart and put it back together?
Basically, everything comes out of the sculpture I made before. So, in other words, if it's something I like and I stop working on it, and I want to, I know what I haven't seen or what I didn't get to, and I try to put it in the next sculpture. So it's a linear process, making one piece, after another. So it's not like I'm starting with no ideas. I sort of have an idea of what it could be or what I haven't seen, but working the way I do is full of surprises. So it's not, if I'm cutting through wood and then I turn the wood over and I'm in the wrong place, that's not where I meant to be, then either I glue it back together and start over, or I use that. So it's a progression of accidents and changing my mind all the time.
Right. And it's interesting because I feel like your work there's something very human about it, something very primordial. And I know you steer away from figuration. It's abstract, but usually abstraction isn't like equal warmth or human traits, and somehow you manage to make something that is completely abstract, and yet it has that incredible human emotion in it. And I think you realize that as you walk around the work, and you need to walk around it many times to really get it, because it's also different from every single angle that you experience it. Can you talk a little bit to that, how these works become sort of peers or almost...
Well, the first thing is that it's sort of a working concept of mine, is if I'm working on something and suddenly it looks like a big dog or something, I have to break it down. Right. Whenever I see too much figuration, I have to get away from it or turn it upside down. But, obviously people interpret things differently, and they're free to interpret it. But I am not I'm not representing anything in an abstract way. It is still all contained. All the information is internal. It's the piece itself. It's the parts that have been moved around, the colors that have been moved around. So it's all self-referential. I mean, that's the way I look at it. But I find that people in general want to organize things, abstract things, or things that are chaotic. And I just was thinking the other day is that people have been looking at stars forever, and in order to make sense of the stars, they had to turn them into dogs, lions, people, and give them names so that they could actually, identify them. And I think that that's part of the human need to organize in your mind with something familiar. So I can't do anything about that. I'm not trying to stop it, but I'm just saying I'm not doing it.
We're doing it. That's why it's called seeing things in things, right? You're inviting
things, not people, not dogs. Anyway, things and things.
Things is very broad, so that's good. moving further into the double wide galleries, I'm really intrigued by some of the pairings that you have there. Some of them are taken where you take trees apart and you show the inside of a tree, but then also the outside of a tree, and you put them next to each other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was early 2000s, and I did a show, and it was called Core Samples, because basically I was at that point picking up these strange or familiar pieces of wood that were parts of trees, and in order to do something with them, I cut them into hundreds small pieces, and I removed the interior, and then I rebuilt the two separately. So the interior, even though it may look like stacked blocks or cylinders, is actually the way that wood grew. So I put it back so that the grain matched the grain to the grain, and so it was actually putting the tree back together. And likewise, when I put the outside together, I was putting together the more familiar part of the tree, the bark, and I put these side by side, as I have a couple in this show, and it was kind of remarkable to me how one's perception of a tree is simple, a branch. You see something and you understand it. But the other part, the geometric part that I cut out, was not so easy to understand, and yet that's the way it grew. And in some cases, I thought that complication of the interior seemed to be larger than the exterior because of the way our brains absorbed the information. It wasn't as familiar.
Right, and there are more pairings in that on the other side of that space where you started making rubber casts, right? You had these tree trunks and kind of wanted to see how that would replicate or look in a different material, and then you altered that as well.
Yes, that was started with, I worked my way out of doing bronze, which I had done some in the 80s, because I began to feeling that bronze was just a replication process. Bronze is only 1/4 of an inch thick, so you're really just looking at a surface, replication of something that you made. And I work primarily, and this show is primarily all wood. I didn't put in any bronze pieces because I like the direct working more. But having done the bronzes, I had these molds around, and I had seen this rubber material, some sort of a architectural gasket, 2-part rubber, and I love the color of it, and I just started filling the molds and using the molds that would have been for the bronze with rubber, and putting those side by side was another sort of transformation, and the color was really great. The light could come through it, and it had a liquid feeling, so I felt that rather than pulling the geometry out of the interior of a tree, it was sort of more of a process that, well, I say liquid, but I mean this amber material where the surface sort of took second stage to the interior and the light. You could see the whole thing through at once, and that was just another transformation. And then I put them together, and as you'll see in the show, they're all propped up with props, and they didn't stand very well, rubber. And in fact, each time I show it, I have to change the props and the wedges. But what I'm doing is matching it up again. So I try to make them stand exactly the same way, even if they don't want to keep this parallel idea.
So it completely changes the perception of the form. And also having it close to the window, the translucency of the rubber is just really is beautiful.
Well, that was one of the only things I knew about installing the show, was I was going to put the rubber pieces by the window.
We would still be installing today if we didn't stop him yesterday. Yes. There are also woodblock prints. Can you talk about that? That's yet another extension of the sculpture.
Well, what I did, and I did this show in a very different space, in a fantastic museum, the Addison Gallery in Andover, and I had 9 rooms, and I could really isolate the different parts of the work. And in this space, that became the major issue for me, is how am I going to organize in some way that makes sense? But you asked me about the woodblock drawings. The woodblock drawing, I think there's only one of them, which is basically a 16-foot woodblock taken from 4 sheets of plywood, very practical. And that is next to the black oil sculptures, and they're all from the exact same time. So I was doing one and then the other, and I was just sort of surprised. The woodblocks were a surprise because unlike you make a sculpture, you see it all the way through, and there it is. But if you print something, once you peel the paper away, you're seeing something completely different. And that was kind of liberating. And so I did, a number of those. But it was really, I call them drawings, but since I don't make drawings, it's really just parallel way of working.
It's again yet another definition of drawing. Sure. It's always connected to sculpture.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in the spine there are cast paper. There's cast paper and then the photographs.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah. Well, quickly, this is going back and forth. Is that I was working. I had some fellowship or something in Dieudonné, and I started casting from wood and paper, and taking that through various iterations. And so that is, I saw these things the way I was making them, and I looked at them and I thought, well, there's no gravity involved. Gravity is kind of like the first thing you have to deal with objects and sculpture. And so that too was liberating. And then I thought, well, maybe can I make sculpture that, off the floor that doesn't have to deal with gravity? And that's where the wall pieces started. So it's always one thing feeds another, not always in the order that you would think, but that's back and forth. And then the photographs, that sort of goes back to my early experience in the photography, working with 4x5 cameras, and I was making very small sculptures. The only thing I had to leave out of this show actually was a table of sculptures, which is okay. It's okay. I didn't have to. I thought there's plenty of information here. Yeah. Too much maybe, but it's there.
Just right.
But I would, just to understand them, I would use my 4x5 camera with a Polaroid back on a film back, which photographers early on, when photographing art, always would take a Polaroid to get the lighting right and then take the transparency or whatever. But the film made a positive and a negative at the same time. And the positive was pale, not very interesting, and the negative was this gummy, old-fashioned negative that really was rich. So I sort of reversed the order and I scanned the negative, and all these prints are the negatives, the 4x5 negatives, because they enabled me a whole nother way to look at the objects.
It's almost like an X-ray of your sculptures. Yeah.
And you read the shadows completely differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And then on the other side, there are sculptures with more color. Can you talk about the way you use color? Because you also said you use color like a material, right?
Yeah, and I'll stay with that idea, because I don't, I would coat the blocks of wood they're starting with paint or, oil and whatever, lamp black. And that would be the starting point, and it's part of the material. So when I work with a piece, it sort of refers to where they came from, what the outside of this original block was, and in a way, sort of a parallel thing to working with the bark, because you go into a tree and you know the outside is the bark. So when I went back to the more geometric pieces, like that line of red blocks on the floor, I would paint the block red and then cut into it. So that sort of became my bark that indicated the outside of the block, however it came out. And color, I have to say, all the color I use is straight from the can. It's a material. It's not, I don't mix it. In fact, I have a lot of sort of dried up cans of paint that I keep trying to revitalize because I like the color, but it's just a material. Yeah.
Well, one of the works, you were painting it yesterday, so as it was installed. So
you're not meant to say
so
that.
it does happen. too much information.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, okay. No, but this is a piece, I've never shown it before. It's the big red, yellow, blue piece that's in the room with the smaller pieces on the bases. And I was made, it was cast in bronze, and it had, the color coding, if you see the small piece in the room, was purely a way to enlarge the piece myself, to keep track of where I was. And at the end of the day, I had to say the colors, having been through sand casting and everything else, were looking a little dreary. So I thought, okay, I'm allowed to do this.
You're the
so
artist.
the piece is from 1989, yes, but there's a little fresh paint on it as of yesterday.
It's to all of our benefit. And then you made new work for outside. And it's interesting because you have said that you don't really like meadows, and you like to keep the architecture, or you like to stay near the architecture. And the works are staying near the architecture, and so they have a human scale, so that we still interact with them as we come in. Can you talk a little bit about these new works?
Yes, that is the scale issue, and I like people to walk around the work, always keeping scale, human scale. That was the big challenge of the Madison Park installation, because it's seen from a distance. This is probably why I made them black and white and put them in a line, so they're very noticeable. But I really think that architecture, it's better than putting a sculpture in the wild, because you're putting it in relationship to a size we understand. And this worked out very well, because to me, now the show starts outside, and you work your way in. So I was very happy with that.
And it does work with the meadow ultimately.
The meadow, yes.
I just have to say that.
It works in the meadow too.
But I want to know what is the biggest difference for you between what happened at the Addison and what happened at the Parrish, and was it a surprise to you to see it at the Parrish, or what was the biggest surprise or difference?
Well, I'd like to say I wasn't surprised, but it was very different. And yes, I was surprised. And there's one thing that I've been commenting on tonight, is that I had made these large sculptures. I had shown them in a museum, but they have never seemed as large to me before. And this is ironic, but something to do with the space, because the ceilings are 50 feet high. And yet I'm really interested and happy to see my work look more monumental here than in any other installation. And I just think that the clean architecture of the building's fantastic, and the light's fantastic.
And the wooden ceilings, I think that.
The wood. But that's way up there.
But it's there, yeah.
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I just so I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know how I was going to organize it in a way that made sense in terms of the really nice organization I had at the Addison. So that's, took a while, took moving things around. I knew where a few things should be, but everything else changed as I saw it, and responded to the space. I mean, the space is incredible, actually. Yeah.
It is, and I think your work makes it look even more incredible. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to open this up to the audience. We have time for a few questions. Are there any questions? Yes, Candace.
You're talking about the large pieces that there are three of them?
The big one in the double wide in the center?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that happened. If you look at the black trunk piece behind it, that was a whole different way of working, because I would haul these hollow trees that I found in New Jersey into the studio, and they had to be cut up into small pieces, because you still have to get them up the elevator. And so I had that tree, both trees, in the studio for quite a while. And the cylindrical one, I thought, well, I'm making wood blocks. Why don't I just ink it up and see if I can take a wood block off the object itself. So that's behind it, and that's coming right off the sculpture. But in the same time, I inked up the other one, so I was just basically using printing ink, and I'm not exactly sure why I did it, because I never printed the one in the center. It was too difficult, but that's where the color came from. Excuse me?
When you say printing ink?
Well, in a wood block, you ink the surface completely, but I was inking surfaces that weren't flat, and I was trying to take impressions from that. They're not rubbings; it's actually printed, and that's sort of how that came together. And I don't know. I have this notion that art is a lot about, or sculpture is a lot about things done for other reasons. In other words, you're doing something for one reason, and then you sort of discover it yourself, and it becomes something else. But you're not planning it all the way, and that's part of sort of the history inherent in the piece. To understanding it is what you had to do to adapt, to fit, to make this thing happen. So.
It's very thick.
Thick. Well, I think it was very thick. I'm not exactly sure.
Thank you.
There's a question here.
It's a general question. I'm always very interested in how people started how artists start to work in a particular area. And my question is, when did you realize that you wanted to be a sculptor versus another kind of artist?
Well, you never wind up making what you thought you were going to make. You never wind up being the artist you thought you were going to be. I started with photography, and then I was making little, 8mm films, and then I couldn't get the equipment in college, so I started making sculpture. No really, big thing beyond that. But I think that people who came to art in the 70s, late 60s, is that there was no money involved. There's no business involved. So you're really kind of communicating with other artists, which I still think should be true, is true. So I don't know. That's circumstantial why I started making sculpture. I was building things all the time, and it just, I slid into that. But none of it's a plan. I don't know that. As a matter of fact, what I was going to say is that, contrary to now, in the 70s, you weren't allowed to call yourself an artist. That was the most pretentious thing you could do. And I remember the first time I tried it. I was on a ferry somewhere, and said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm an artist." And she said, "Hey, I thought he was. He's an artist." So I don't know what it was. It was just a silly thing, but you don't call yourself an artist. You have to be an artist. So.
Who were some of the artists that you were talking to at the time?
Well, I was very lucky to catch on to this, and I have to thank Dorothea for this, because she said, "Oh, you got to go to Max's Kansas City." I said, "Oh, yeah." So it was different. You worked till midnight, and then you went to Max's Kansas City, and you could sit there. The artists could sit there. You didn't have to order food, so therefore, I was with Smithson, with Sarah, with Mel Bachner, Dorothea, Chuck Close. I'm just trying to think who was. There's just whatever. There are a lot of people around, and I felt, like we were talking about earlier, that it was a funny time to come to New York, because the conceptual artists, the people I really liked, had staked out their positions in a circle, and it didn't seem very clear how you could possibly break into that. But I was 23 when I had my first show, at 24 maybe, at Artist Space. So I was in this position, and I traveled around installing shows, documented for other people, and so I was kind of the kid. So it was good, meeting Saul LeWitt, and everybody it was great, but I was no threat.
Do you think that gave you some freedom to be the kid and
yeah, I mean,
to be different?
yeah, but then it said, okay, how am I going to really do something? What am I doing? What I'm doing differently? Everything I'm making is derivative. You know, the more you know, kind of the harder it gets. But it was a very interesting time, and you know, many stories. But because you know, traveling and being with all these artists who were the people that I'd read about in college when I came to New York, so that was pretty great.
Right. One more question in the back.
Yeah, there's obviously a multi-dimensional, three-dimensional aspect to what we see in the gallery, and there's obviously a multifaceted approach you've had to your artwork. I'm just curious, from your perspective, how do you think about and rank, like, you know, the skills or the attributes of what we see? There's obviously like an analytical or almost like an engineering component to what you do, and there's the artistic component that you just mentioned, and obviously a huge creative component, like maybe other aspects that I'm not even mentioning. But like, how do you think about what the attributes or the skills that we see? How do you rank them?
That's right. You're asking for a hierarchy of me, you know, of the objects. To me, I can't do that. But I look at things and you know I made them then, and I'm not going to make them again. I mean, you're just moving through this stuff. I can't imagine working with that rubber again. I can't, you know, I'm not going out with a chainsaw. I'm not doing, you know, but, you know, things change and things evolve. The thing about this show is it turns out that the really monumental pieces were all done very early in my career. We're pretty much through the 90s, and I haven't worked that way since. But, you know, because I was doing other things. So I can't really, you know, the most interesting thing, as anyone would say, is what I'm doing now. And like the wall piece in the lobby was just finished.
Right.
I made it for this show, and I'm very excited by that. But it looks very good up against a piece, the Black Dots, that was made in 1989. So I see these currents myself, and it's really nice to have an opportunity to see these connections all in one place. So I'm not sure I can answer your question.
Okay, is there one more question? No, I think, yeah, one more in the back there. Yeah.
You have a huge career in the US, and I'm very astonished that you never show you, maybe you already show your work in Europe or in other countries abroad. Why?
I'm not quite sure.
She's asking that you have a big career in the US and why you haven't shown in other countries.
Oh,
or if that's
sculpture. Sculpture is a very difficult thing.
I discovered your work today, and I was astonished by this beauty, this major artwork, and I've never heard about you in Europe before.
Okay, well, I'm sort of glad you're asking that. That's when I had the show at the Addison, someone came in and said, "This is fantastic. This work is incredible. Why don't I know you?" Now, I say, okay, well, clearly they're not doing something, but you know, yeah, don't know. I just paid more attention to the work and the artists I worked with, and I never really, you know, was much at publicity or pushing myself or whatever it is. But yeah, and then the other was I was being very practical. Is people would rather roll up a, you know, or ship canvases or store canvases. Sculpture takes a real commitment, and so you know, that's made the, you know, Europe a little difficult.
Okay, well, I want to thank Mel for this conversation and for the amazing work that you gifted us with. Thank you.
Thank you.